If you look at two examples, if you read the Anglo-Saxon media and you Google Belt and Road Initiative, you only get the negative stories. So you get a negative story about China building a port in Sri Lanka, which the Sri Lankans couldn't afford, and therefore it became an untenable debt for Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lanka then had to cede the port to China. And the argument there is that China was obviously exploiting Sri Lanka. But actually, if you look at it objectively, in some ways the Sri Lankans got the better deal because they got a whole port without spending any money, and now China has to manage the economics of the port. So actually Sri Lanka benefited from that deal, what was supposed to be a mistake. And similarly, clearly there were some mistakes made also in the proposal to build an east-west railway in Malaysia, right? And there were allegations of corruption involving the former Prime Minister Najib, and there were some problems there. But once again, when the new Prime Minister came in, Dr. Mahathir came in, China and Malaysia worked out a new agreement, right? So this shows how China can adapt and be flexible. And it's also important to realize that there are some remarkable success stories in the Belt and Road Initiative. One, for example, for many years, it would take the citizens of Uzbekistan several days to cross from one side of the country to another because there's a mountainous terrain in between. But then the Chinese came along and they built a fast train in 900 days. And that's a remarkable gift on the part of China to Uzbekistan. So these positive stories are not told.
If there is any debt trap, it's the responsibility of those nations in Africa who have mismanaged their economies. You can't go back and blame China for any mishap. If you are planning an economy, if you have resources to mobilize, if you have goals to achieve in any area or in any sector, definitely you have to have the correct policies and you have to have the institutional mechanism to implement this. China would be willing to support and help allow governments to borrow money, but ultimately the management issue falls on the responsibility of the African side. Blaming China for debt traps is simply defaming the achievements and probably trying to create some rift between African and Chinese contributions in the solidarity that has achieved the economic development we see today. One of the worrying things for these hegemonistic forces globally is China working with Africa to extricate Africa from the marginalization that it exists today and move forward in solidarity with the peoples of Africa. If there are mistakes done by African government, debt traps will have to be managed by learning from mistakes and correcting the handling of the economies that have failed into this trap.
Hello everyone, welcome to Gerard for Africa, your go-to channel for insightful discussions on global development, economic transformation, and Africa's evolving partnership with the world. In today's video, we dive deep into the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in history, often misrepresented as a debt trap by the Western media. We'll explore why that narrative doesn't hold up to scrutiny. From Sri Lanka's Hambantota port to Kenya's Mombasa-Nairobi railway, and even the Uzbekistan's transformative high-speed train project, will highlight how China investments are reshaping economies and empowering nations. We'll also unpack how Western powers, driven by a sense of geopolitical loss, perpetuate negative stories about the BRI while ignoring its success stories. Is the BRI truly a debt trap or a lifeline for developing countries in need of infrastructure and growth? Stay tuned as we challenge misconceptions, celebrate Africa's partnership, and examine the shifting balance of global power. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Gerard for Africa for more in-depth discussions. Let's get started.
And you got to understand, that's why 137 countries agree to join the Belt and Road Initiative, because they also want to have fast trains, modern ports, good highways, good airports in their countries. And China is now #1 in the world in infrastructure. So paradoxically, even though I lived in New York for 10 years, even though the United States is obviously a more developed and a richer country than China is by far, if you want to see a first world airport, you go to Beijing. If you want to see a third world airport, you go to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. And that's stunning, isn't it? If you want to see a high-speed first world train, you see the train within Shanghai and Beijing. If you want to see a third world train, take the Acela between New York and Boston. That's a paradox, that the world's richest country has a third world infrastructure when China, which is still a relatively poor country, has a first world infrastructure.
It's the sick mind of hegemonistic powers. It's sick because why impose sanctions? What is the legality of imposing any sanction? What is the morality of imposing any sanction on any nation? It's a big question mark. It's not only sanctioning Eritrea, but sanctioning all those who uphold their independence and sovereignty. If they don't like you, they will impose sanctions. They will try to cripple your economies. They will try to incite conflict. They will try to destabilize and interfere. And they have no moral or legal high ground to come and intervene or even impose sanctions on any nation. We're fed up of this stupid idea of imposing your will on others' sovereign and independent choice and trying to cripple their economies and try to create the disruptions here and there. One of the reasons for trying to create a rift between China and Africa is to promote their own agenda of dominance. And anyone who disagrees with them will have to be punished. For us, been a long experience, we've been able to face this challenge and in solidarity with our partners in Africa, with China, Asia, Europe, Americas, definitely. It's not deniable. It does disrupt economic development here and there. It cripples abilities here and there. But that's one of the challenges. The damage done to our economy through these sanctions have been tremendous. But we say we have learned our lesson. It has made us more resilient and more determined to continue our struggle, endeavor to change the quality of life by improving our economy.
I just spoke to a couple of people from the African continent, one from Nigeria, one from Kenya, and they were talking about, and to your point, in Kenya, this rail system, it's one thing to give aid to a country, but now if you've got a product and you can get on a train and get there quickly and sell your product before it rots, it's the same sort of thing you were talking about with Uzbekistan. They were saying that they think perhaps the reason China's, and I want to get your thoughts on this, China's relationship with the African continent is different than the United States is because China's still, as you said, a relatively poor country. It's a developing country in a sense, although it's a major power, but it's gone through this development in recent years. It's kind of been in those shoes, whereas the United States is so removed from that, they see things differently. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and it's actually a tragedy that when you read the Anglo-Saxon media on the relations between China and Africa, you read again only the negative stories about what China is doing in Africa, and none of the positive stories come out. And whenever somebody asks me a question about China and Africa, I say that I respect the Africans' ability to make their own decisions on what is good for their societies. And so if China hosts a China-Africa summit, and all the African heads of government and African heads of state turn up for the summit, they are voting with their feet to show that they have confidence in what China is doing in Africa. And at the end of the day, and certainly it'd be good for the rest of the world to also invite, it'd be good for the United States to invite all 54 or 53 plus African heads of state to come to Washington, D.C. too. And also make the same kind of offers that China makes. That would be very good for the world. It'd be very good for the world to see the development of Africa, and especially very good for Europe to see the development of Africa. And in fact, logically, it should be Europe that should be cheering Chinese investment in Africa. But unfortunately, since Europe is often geopolitically deferential to Washington, D.C., it has not been cheering Chinese investment in Africa.
You mentioned all the negative, none of the positive. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it is very difficult, I guess especially for what I call the Anglo-Saxon mind, to conceive of a world where the world's number one power is neither a Western power nor an Anglo-Saxon power. And if you look at it objectively, the 19th century, the UK was the number one power. Anglo-Saxon country. In the 20th century, United States was the number one power, Anglo-Saxon country. In the 21st century, it's very clear the number one power will be China. In fact, the 21st century will be an Asian century. And so the sense of loss, the sense of not being in power or in control is very powerful, very deep. And so there is a lot of resistance to accepting a world where the number one power is no longer Anglo-Saxon. And I think there's this deep psychological reluctance to accept the fact that the world has changed fundamentally since China, India, and the rest of Asia have come back.
Do you agree with Professor Kishore Mahbubani's view that the Belt and Road Initiative is not a debt trap, but rather a series of transformative infrastructure projects unfairly portrayed by Western media? The BRI has often been labeled a debt trap by Western media, but this narrative doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Take Sri Lanka, often cited as a prime example. China holds only about 10% of its external debt, while the majority is owed to Western financial institutions and private bondholders. Similarly, in Pakistan, Chinese loans make up around 30% of the country's external debt. These figures show that China is far from being the primary cause of debt distress in these nations. What the BRI actually provides is essential infrastructure that many developing countries urgently need. In Kenya, for instance, the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway, built with $3.6 billion in Chinese financing, has slashed travel times and boosted trade and tourism. In Greece, Chinese investments in Piraeus Port transformed it into the Mediterranean's busiest, revitalizing the local economy. The Laos-China Railway, which opened in 2021, is expected to increase Laos's GDP by 1.5% annually by facilitating trade and tourism. Far from being traps, these projects offer long-term benefits and opportunities for growth. Contrary to claims of asset seizures, China frequently renegotiates loans to ease the financial burden on partner nations. Ethiopia, for example, saw $4 billion of railway debt restructured to provide more manageable repayment terms. Zambia has also benefited from China's participation in the G20's Common Framework for Debt Relief. Even the much-debated Hambantota port in Sri Lanka was leased to a Chinese company under a commercial agreement, not seized. While challenges like debt sustainability and project feasibility remain, many BRI projects have proven to be lifelines for economic growth. The debt trap narrative oversimplifies a complex global initiative and unfairly discounts the transformative benefits the BRI has brought to numerous countries. What do you think? Share your thoughts and leave your comments below. If you like what you watched, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.